Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Los Angeles is Perry Wong. He's the Managing Director of Research at the Milken Institute. With us from Boston is Ravi Ramamurthy. He's a distinguished professor and the Director of Northeastern University Center for Emerging Markets. John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors. He joins us from New York. And with us from Montreal is Yan Wong. He's a partner with Alpine Macro and their Chief Emerging Markets and China Strategist. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Yan Wong, let me start with you. These are pretty sweeping predictions by this report by Standard Chartered, China being the #1 economy measured by GDP by 2030. But let's take a step back and look at Chinese growth for 2018. That was last year. Those figures have just come out. China grew by 6.6% last year. That's relatively low for China. And given those figures and the general slowdown, do you think that the country is still on target to be the biggest economy by 2030?
Yes, I do think so. I think it's not whether or not. It's actually just when this will happen. You know, think about it. If we just extrapolate Chinese growth, let's say if the Chinese economy is able to grow, let's say 6% in nominal terms, while the U.S., let's say, grow at 2.5% in nominal terms, then about 10 years, China will be able to surpass the U.S. in terms of the size of the economy. So I have no doubt this will happen. It will happen even, let's say, a year early or a year later. I think that will be the question. But overall, I think the trend is very, very clear.
All right, let's go to Boston to Ravi. And Ravi, the Standard Chartered report also predicts that India will pull ahead of the United States by 2030. Does that surprise you in any way?
It does, and I actually don't think it'll happen. I think the projections for India are probably a little too optimistic. It will happen, though, go back to the point made by the earlier speaker, it will happen at some point. The exact time, I think, is a little bit up to debate. I think 2030 may be a bit too early. 2040, I think, looks much more likely that India will overtake. And we're talking about overtaking, measuring GDP and purchasing power parity terms. This is not based on official exchange rates.
All right, let's go to John. John, let's look at the other side of these predictions, the United States dropping into third place. Why would the United States drop into third place? Will it just be because of a slow economy or because it'll basically be population size that'll be driving economies in the next 10 years?
I don't know that I can accept the premise in the Standard Chartered report, Anand. What we're looking at here, again, as your speaker just mentioned, is that it's a flawed methodology that's based on purchasing power parity rather than, say, productivity per capita or GDP per capita or market exchange rates. The trend lines are accurate. As your first speaker said, China will soon surpass the United States. When that will be, it's a dangerous game of precision forecasting. India will be fortunate if it surpasses Japan in the next 30 years. It is so far behind in terms of overall GDP, but it has 1.5 billion people. So yes, it'll have a large economy, but my sense is we'll see the U.S. and the U.S. and China at #1 and 2 for the next 3 decades.
Perry Wong, let me ask you first, what are your thoughts on this report from Standard Chartered?
Well, I think it's very predictable that the Chinese economies, I think very soon, will surpass the U.S. economy in terms of size. But also, I would like to go back to the population base. And yeah, you have a 1.4 billion people economy, which you just make the simple assumption, everyone can see that, but that's not the point. The point, I think, is productivity and the orientation of the economies that matter more in terms of influence.
If we look at this list, we also see Indonesia, Egypt, and Turkey in the top 10. What do you make of that, Perry Wong?
Well, Indonesia, and also if you look at the population base, is quite sizable in Asia and on a global stage. But I think the economy also is growing in the right direction. So if it can continue under the current policy and given a rather stable Southeast Asian political and economic orders or standards, then I think it's certainly a predictable outcome. I can see that happen.
John, I just want to get back to you and what you were saying about how this was measured in this report by Standard Chartered. I mean, what role will mass consumer markets play in this measurement?
An enormous role, Anand. And I think, again, the PR team at Standard Chartered did an excellent job in getting everyone to focus on this index over the last couple of weeks. I don't think the actual rankings are newsworthy, but what I think is most important here is the trend lines, that Asia and its massive consumer market and a growing middle class really will become the center of the global economy in the decades ahead. We see it having happened already in China, especially after China was permitted to join the WTO 20 years ago. We see with the phenomenal growth of India, now at 7 to 8% growth rates, probably for the foreseeable future. The Southeast Asia tigers that will continue to grow at rapid rates. And I think you're seeing a relative decline in Western Europe because of a lack of innovation. We have significant demographic problems there as well. And I think also the great other story is Africa. There are going to be a number of economies in Africa that will also be leapfrogging ahead of Western economies in the decades to come.
Yan Wang, a few days ago, I talked with the former Chinese ambassador, at least the former United States ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy. He's also a Chinese scholar right now at the Wilson Institute. And I asked him about this, and this is what he had to say. Let's listen to it.
China down the road, if it's able to sustain its rapid economic growth, will not only have a larger economy than we have, but it will have comparable levels of prosperity. If you use the purchasing power parity measurement, China's economy is already larger than ours.
So, Yan Wang, if we listen to what Stapleton Roy, the ambassador, was saying there, how does China, I mean, in world measurement, in terms of growth, do in things like innovation?
I agree with many speakers just mentioned. I think, obviously the size of the Chinese population matters a lot in terms of the size of the economy. So Chinese growth obviously brings a lot of prosperity, brings higher income, brings, lift people's living standard. All the Asian countries, if all the Asian countries are able to do that, it's a tremendously positive development for the human being. But also, I think we also need to put a proper perspective on these things. We need to understand the size of the Chinese economy is becoming bigger is purely because China has a population that is 4 times as large as the US population. So in terms of per capita GDP, in terms of productivity, China is still way behind most advanced countries. So to drive China to continue to develop, lifting productivity, increasing efficiency, improve renovation, I think all these things will matter fundamentally to lift China to the next stage.
Ravi Ramamurthy, if we look at another metric right now, if we see these countries with great economic growth rates, and we look at who are the beneficiaries of this. If we take a country like India, I mean, India, this report says, is predicted to grow to the world's 2nd largest economy. But does that mean there's going to be a rise in living standards for everyone? Because there also was another report a few days ago which said that the 9 richest people in India have as much wealth as the bottom 50%.
That's a fair question. I think let's not forget, when we talk about India becoming the 2nd largest economy, as I said before, we're measuring it in PPP terms. And just to give your audience a sense of how important that is, how you measure it, India's GDP in PPP terms is 4 times what it is at market exchange rates. So keep that in mind when you talk about how big or how important a player India will be on the global stage. Now that said, going back to your question, the problem of unequal incomes is a global problem, and India is no exception to it. A lot of the benefits of rapid growth have gone to a very small slice of the population. And in India's case particularly, we have a very large number of young people entering the labor force, and creating jobs for all of them and keeping them productively employed is a very important part of actually achieving these growth rates that India's expected to achieve. So if you can't harness the expanding labor force, and this is a big difference between China and India. China's labor force has already peaked. India's has a long way to go. But if you cannot harness that labor force, and there are some indications already that India is struggling to harness the labor force productively, then India would have a major social challenge ahead of itself.
But as you point out, Ravi, the big advantage India has is that half of its population is under the age of 25. When we look around the world, there is an aging population.
That's true. So it is potentially an advantage. People always talked about the demographic dividend for the Indian case, but it's not automatic, unless the policies are in place to harness that talent and to actually nurture and develop the talent and give it the skills it requires, especially as technological change takes hold. This can turn, it's a double-edged sword that could actually hurt more than it helps. And frankly, I'm a bit concerned about the administrative capacity of the Indian government to be able to plan and execute policies that will harness the human talent that India potentially has to offer.
Perry Wong, wealth inequality is also prevalent in China if we use the measurement that is commonly used, which is the Gini coefficient. How does the Chinese government ensure that the wealth of the country is distributed fairly?
Yeah, I think to begin with, I think I totally agree with the previous speakers. I think the inclusiveness at the beginning during the rapid development stage is critical. So in other words, I think if you look at the Chinese experience, I wouldn't call it model, but experience, is that the Chinese government did several things right with the massive infrastructure building, rapid urbanization, and most importantly, it included almost everyone, and you can say everyone, from peasants to workers to young people and middle-aged people. So everyone got off in a pretty good start. Now, it came later with problems when the accumulation of wealth becomes so massive and the reform in enterprises level actually affected the wealth distributions. So, but that's a later stage game. So the success comes with the utilization of utilization of workforce and a rather equal distribution of wealth, at least at the very beginning. So everyone is fourth.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.